All right, kids, in 2009, two economists wrote a book called Creating an Opportunity Society, where they came to the conclusion that in order to avoid poverty, a household needed to do these three things: graduate from high school, wait until they were married and at least 21 to have a child, and get a job working full time, which is what we're going to talk about today. Since then, the pull yourselves up by your bootstraps crowd has been saying this like it's biblical or something.
According to the liberal Brookings Institution, if you make just these three decisions, you'll do fine.
You need to only do three things to avoid living in poverty.
Graduate from high school, work hard, and get married before you have children.
Do these three things to avoid poverty. With that said, for the sake of this video, I need to pretend that merely 2.5 years after Brookings first posted an article presenting these three norms, as they're referred to, they did not provide an update saying that even when Black Americans do follow all three norms, their economic prospects are worse than whites. We'll focus on this black-white divide. Before I continue, I just want to say that I'm glad that so many are proposing this three-prong approach to create more opportunities in America, and those recommendations are fine. Everyone should follow them to the best of their ability. But while we are aware that those in poverty are more likely to drop out of high school and have a baby out of wedlock or remain unmarried, what's not acknowledged is that poverty isn't always something that can be determined by individual decision making. Generations remain impoverished simply based on social determinants like the zip code they were born in or their parents' income and education, which are out of people's control. Speaking of, as you'll see today, it may be harder to get a full-time job due to your race and even what name your parents decided to call you. Consider an experiment by sociologist Diva Pager, who sent experimenters 2 by 2, one black and one white, to apply for 340 job ads in New York City. She gave each pair resumes doctored to have identical qualifications. She gave them scripts so that the applicants said the same things when handing in their applications. She even dressed them alike. She found that black applicants got half the callbacks that white applicants got with the same credentials. In 2004, economists studied how race, ethnicity, and racism affects hiring decisions. They wondered, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lashika and Jamal? It was a field experiment on labor market discrimination, as the title presented. Names and quality were randomly assigned to resumes, and they were sent out to over 1,300 employment ads in Chicago and Boston. Their results revealed statistically significant differences in the number of callbacks each resume received based on whether the name sounded white or black. Researchers found that white names had a 9.65% chance of receiving a callback, while the names of their black counterparts had a 6.45% chance. Put in other words, these results imply that a white applicant should expect on average one callback for every 10 ads he or she applies to. On the other hand, a black applicant would need to apply to about 15 different ads to achieve the same results. Results were nearly identical in both cities, by the way. So, when faced with observably similar black and white applicants, do employers favor the white ones? Yes. And the same idea applies to black people responding to ads for apartment rentals, seeking stays in Airbnb spaces, email replies from professors, and interest from other races in dating apps. Black people receive far less responses than white people. Oh, and also, I only gave you first names when saying the title of the study earlier. The randomly assigned names were Emily Walsh, Greg Baker, Lashika Washington, and Jamal Jones. I've talked about the plight that the Jamals of the world may have in the labor market previously on this channel, and before I continue, I want to mention a study from 2015 that compared just 4 names, 2 white-sounding names, 1 male, 1 female, and 2 black-sounding names, 1 male, 1 female, and was widely cited by the media like it was some sign of positive racial progress. And in order to signal race, they used the last names of Washington and Jefferson. According to U.S. Census data, a majority of people in this country who have these last names are black. While that census data is true, surnames or last names are inherited or shared through marriage. They're not nearly as indicative of race as given names or first names in a country like America, especially for a race of people who either adopted last names in order to assimilate or were branded with an enslaver's last name against their will. A study out of UCLA suggests that whatever I mentioned up until this point may not just show us that all black-sounding names will come with the same thoughts or misguided assumptions, when most often a black-sounding name also signals the person's social status, whether they're poor or not. The study creator first looked at names he found in nearly 20 years of birth records from New York State. With this, he could examine names commonly given by black or white mothers and the average levels of education of those mothers. He was also able to get a hold of the raw data from more than a dozen previous research projects dating back to the one from 2004 that I just discussed. From names I can't pronounce, but here they are because I would like to give them credit. Anyways, he conducted a survey experiment and asked respondents which race they would associate to each name on the list. He asked the question several ways. He combined a white first name with a white last name and a black first name with a black last name, while also mixing white and black first names and white and black last names. And I'm just going to read this part from the article exactly as it's written. For example, in his study, the name most commonly and correctly judged as a black-sounding name was Deshaun. This name was also most commonly given by black mothers with a high school degree or less. Names most commonly given by black mothers with a college education, such as Jalen, were much less likely to be associated as a black-sounding name. While a popular black name from the study, based on birth records, was Bria, but it was difficult for survey respondents to correctly identify that name racially. Bria, apparently, isn't a strong enough signal of blackness, he said. So again, these names do not always make people think about race in the ways that researchers had previously assumed, he said. Only commonly given black names from lower social status origins are a strong signal of a person's race. We are sending signals of both social class and race when we use names like Lakeisha and Jamal. Let's not forget that Americans associate poor with black, and the media portrayal is the same. Along with this country's role in placing black people in the lower class with denial to access to housing, banking, land acquisition, and jobs. Also, this.
So there were a couple of big findings from the study. One is that a criminal record had a huge impact on hiring outcomes. Whites were about half as likely to receive a callback as equally qualified non-offenders. For blacks, the effect was even a little bit larger. One of the other big findings that was a surprise to me was just about the direct effects of race and racial discrimination. So a black man with no criminal background fared no better than a white applicant just released from prison.
If you've noticed that some of these experiments are from a decade or two ago, then you should know that the same sociologist and her peoples published a meta-analysis including every field experiment on hiring since the first ones were completed in the 1980s. Across 24 studies, black applicants were called back 36% less than white applicants with the same qualifications. Additionally, not a single study found a reliable anti-white bias, and the rate of discrimination is the same today as it was in the 1980s. That's systemic racism, and not that those who don't believe in it believe in science, but the scientific method used in experiments and studies prove this. Now, is this discrimination towards black people intentional? Does this mean that hiring managers are racist? Well, there was a study from 2011 that suggested it's not that recruiters themselves necessarily have a racial bias. Instead, they fear some of their customers do. And this implicit or explicit bias clearly affects wages and wealth. But more than that, since healthcare is so tied to employment in America, it affects health. And as we talked about last week, could impact debt and credit. Whatever the case, escaping or avoiding poverty isn't as simple as telling people to get a job, or a full-time job at that. I need to pause and say, numbers don't lie. The book, Creating an Opportunity Society, shows their work. However, there are a few notes that we need to be aware of according to this Vox article. Number one, very, very few people obey none of what the authors of this book consider norms. Look at that table. Only about 3.4 million people, a little over 1% of the population at the time, were in families in the none column. Specifically, there are more people who followed all three norms than followed none of them. Number two, they found that only 2% of persons in families that follow all three norms were poor, 76% of persons in families that followed none were poor, and 73.8% of those who followed all three were at least middle class. And three, this data only captures income from 2007, that 1 year. Plus, this study excluded households headed by people under 25, the elderly, and people on disability from their analysis. Yet, this study will be used to dispel systemic racism or cut government assistance and social programs, despite the fact that the authors of that study are advocates for government programs to expand the use of IUDs and other highly effective, long-lasting forms of birth control. But certain people will skim over this. The book written about this topic also supports more investment in schools and policies that produce a bigger and better job market. Their recommendations include more investment in high-quality preschool, national standards for K-12 education, and making higher education more affordable. So yeah, numbers don't lie. Systemic racism is real, and science proves it. Check the sources, and since everything I've presented uses the scientific method, these studies are repeatable. People can conduct them themselves, but I'm sure opponents and critics will come up with something. But we gonna be alright.